welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to this podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that you will enjoy and will want you to come back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get into our main event, for folks who are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. If you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to submit a donation to help us grow this phenomenal platform, you can go to Cash App and find our handle, $IDTALK4ED, or you can go to Venmo and use our handle @Kwame SM. That's KWAMESM. And to catch up on past episodes of this podcast, you can go to our website at IdentityTalk4Educators.com, or you can just go to our YouTube channel, which is under my name, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And of course, thank you all for your support. It's always appreciated. I'm so excited about today's episode because we're going to be talking about a little bit of everything. We're going to be talking about third culture kids, international schools. We're going to be talking about just the journey of trying to find that space of belonging when you are a third culture kid, because when you're traveling so much, you're just trying to figure out, how do I fit into this space? How do I get acclimated? How do I make sense of who I am? So there's so many nuances and so many complexities that come with this journey. And I'm just happy to have a guest that can speak candidly about those nuances that come with being a third culture kid, and just how that lingers with you as you go into adulthood, as you're trying to make sense of who you are and what your identities are, and just how others perceive who you are. So without further ado, I want to bring on today's guest, Kanako Suwa, to the podcast to talk about her journey and what led her to want to get into this thing that we love called education. So I'm going to bring Kanako on to talk with us. Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Not bad. How are things?
Pretty good. Pretty good. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, and I'm excited to have you here. Been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so glad that it's the last one I'm going to have before I go on vacation. So thank you for that.
No, thank you for having me.
Let's start from the beginning, as we always do here on this podcast. So I know that originally from Japan, but you've been in so many different places. So I want to just give you a chance, for those who aren't familiar with your journey, to just share about those early years and some of those transitions that you were going through at that time.
Yeah, so I was born in Japan, and I actually lived in Japan until I was 10. But in the first 10 years of my life, I lived in 4 different cities in Japan. And so moving was sort of a constant in my life. When I started grade 5, my dad had to move to Taipei for work. And so I went with him, and my parents put me in the American school there. Taipei American School was sort of where my TCK journey began. And I spent 5 years there, going through middle school and my freshman year of high school. And then this was like so devastating and it was heartbreaking, but we had to move back to Japan again for my dad's job. And so I finished high school in Japan. I went to a semi-international school where the school followed the national Japanese curriculum, but our English classes were divided into levels, and so that's kind of how I kept up my English and my academic vocabulary. And then I went to the US for college. I got my teaching license from Massachusetts. And then I got my first job teaching ESL, elementary ESL in Vietnam. And that was the first 5 years of my teaching career. I'm now in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I'm at the end of my second year now here.
Awesome. I want to touch on your transition from Taipei and going back to Japan. And of course, when you're at the international school in Taipei, you're being exposed to American culture, you're being exposed to people from different parts of the globe, which then has an influence on your socialization. So
Mhm.
when you came back to Japan to start high school, how connected did you feel going back to your home country? Was there an internal conflict you were going through? Were there some struggles you were dealing with as you were trying to readjust back into that life?
Yeah, there were two huge aspects of my identity that was really like I was exploring it sort of at the end of middle school going into ninth grade. And that kind of had to stop when I moved back to Japan. So there's obviously that cultural piece because I felt like I was never Japanese enough compared to my peers who grew up all of their lives in Japan. But I also wasn't like foreign or I didn't look like a foreigner. I think it helped a little bit that my high school had a lot of students who had lived abroad before. But even within that group, I was one of the last ones to return to Japan. A lot of them had started in middle school there. And so I think I missed out on the pop cultural references that everyone grew up with in middle school. And that was a huge part. So that's the cultural part. I was also at the end of middle school sort of was exploring my sexuality. And I think that was allowed because I was at the American school. And so when I moved back to Japan, I mean, I instantly kind of felt like that wasn't an avenue I could continue to explore because of how conservative Japan is and the views around LGBTQ community in Japan. And so during high school, I would just play off like my crushes for female characters on TV or whatever as like more like an admiration. Like I wanted to be like them and not as like a crush. Yeah. So culturally, I struggled a little bit. And then like exploring my sexuality was just more internal, right? But I remember being in Japan during high school thinking, this is not where I want to be for college or for the rest of my life because it's not allowing me to explore who I am.
And that's a lot to have to navigate at that young of an age. So you're in Taipei, you go back to Japan, you eventually start college in Boston. So, funny story that I just learned in my research for this, I was a BPS teacher, Boston Public Schools teacher,
What?
at the same
What?
time you were at BU. Yeah, I was
No
a Boston
way.
Public Schools teacher for 5 years. I was teaching at the Lee School in Dorchester while
Wow.
you were at BU. Yeah, so we probably crossed paths somewhere,
Probably. Yeah.
maybe in the South End or somewhere, and we didn't even know each other,
Wow. What a
which I thought was
coincidence.
interesting. But I want you to talk to me about moving to Boston. And for those who have never been to Boston, Massachusetts, Boston is very much a racially segregated city. There is a history of racism and other forms of discrimination that are still very much prevalent there today. But I can imagine there had to have been a culture shock, even though you had been exposed and around American culture just through the international
Mhm.
school circuit. Now being in the university space in the United States, tell me what that experience was like and kind of where you were in your identity journey at that time.
One thing I quickly realized when I moved to Boston was I'd never actually been around that many white people at once. Taipei American School, when I went there, was predominantly Asian students. And moving back to Japan, obviously it's pretty homogenous. And so it was sort of a visual culture shock to me, and especially in the School of Education. It's one of the smallest divisions within BU. I want to say maybe like 150 students in my year, and I can count like maybe less than 10 people of color in my cohort. Everybody else was middle class white girls. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it was a big change from what I was used to. At the same time, moving to Boston, going to university was like liberating. I think moving away from my family helped. I was super fortunate to find a good group of friends my first year who, like, they're still my best friends to this day.
Nice.
And they taught me a lot about American culture, starting with like what TV shows I needed to catch up on that I haven't watched growing up. And then just like teaching me that it's okay to explore who I am and not really judging the things that I was trying out to figure out who I was.
And so at that time, when you were at BU, what were you majoring in?
Bilingual education for pre-K through 6.
So you clearly wanted to get into education. So now
Mhm.
I'm wondering, were there certain parts of your schooling, now K to 12 in the international school circuit, that told you, you know what? I want to be able to help folks navigate what I'm currently navigating, and I don't want them to feel the same way that I felt as a third culture student. I'm sure that was part of the inspiration, but were there certain people or were there certain moments that also inspire you to want to go down this career path of education?
Yes, there's two distinct circumstances. When I was in 8th grade, I was on the swim team and I volunteered to join this program called Swim Zone. It was a program where we taught younger kids how to swim. And I worked
Hmm.
with a little kid in that program who I think looking back, I think he had some mobility challenges, but he was one of my students in the pool. And I think that's where my love for teaching started because it was just so much fun to watch him like be able to do the things he couldn't do the week before. And the progress is so evident in a swimming pool. It's like, how far can you go? What kind of different swimming styles are you able to do now? And so whenever I had him in my little swimming pool lane, I was proud of his progress. And then I was like, oh my gosh, like I helped this person, this kid, be a better swimmer. And so that feeling, I think, is what motivated me to go into education. Now, I thought that I could be like a swimming instructor. And then looking into it a little bit more, I realized I had to get like a PE teacher license first. And if you know anything about me, I'm like so uncoordinated on land that I wasn't ever going to be a PE teacher. And so I thought about like what else I'd experienced that I could turn into teaching. When I moved back to Japan, I worked at a bilingual Saturday school and summer camp. It was a program for Japanese students, elementary students who lived abroad in the past. And so they would come to our program to maintain their English. And that's when I was like, oh, I like teaching these bilingual kids. Some of them speak better English than others, but it was really cool to watch. Like, I got speaking English and Japanese fluently myself. I got to see where like transfer of language happened. And then I thought about the teacher I had in fifth grade when I first moved to Taipei, Mr. Gricky, and how kind he was and how supportive he was. Like, I went to Taipei with no English, like zero English. And he just had so much patience for me. And I learned quite a bit of English in my first year. So I reached out to him and I said, I'm considering a career in education. Just kind of want to know what you think. And he was like, go for it. It seems like you already like teaching. And if ESL is the path you want to go, I like do it. And so those were the key moments, the key factors in why I'm where I am now.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. And this is a question that just popped in my head. So, as someone who is an English language teacher, I'm thinking about international schools.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this a lot on the educator side of things, where there's a great deal of accentism that takes place,
Mm-hmm.
where I've heard parents and I've heard even recruiters and other folks say, well, you know what? Like, where are you coming from? You know, with that accent, you sound different. And sometimes it's because of this distinction that you may not get a job. It's because of this distinction in your accent that you will be subjected to different forms of discrimination and prejudice within your school community. So I'm wondering, as someone who is teaching English as a second language to students within the international school, how do you reconcile with that, knowing that it exists? Is that something that's in the back of your mind as you're teaching these different lessons?
Yeah, it is. And I am so fortunate to speak English the way I do, right? But my first job in Vietnam, my first back to school night when parents came, I got a lot of questions about like you're not American, how can you teach English?
Right.
And like that had nothing to do with the way I spoke. It was just about my passport and where I was from. And I had explained to the parents like I might not be American, but I've been where your kids are right now. 10, 13 years ago, I was that kid that didn't speak English and sat in class and didn't really know what to do. So, on top of my English being fluent, I also understand like the psychological aspect of being in a school where you don't understand the language yet. And I also told them like I'm also bilingual. I use everything I know in Japanese in my daily life. And if you want, like I can support your children developing their abilities in both languages too, and not just English, so that they don't lose their Vietnamese, which was the big population there. And it took some convincing, I think, for some of the parents to let go of the idea that the ESL teacher had to be a native English speaker, that they had to be a white teacher. And I hope that now that they, I worked with them, I worked at that school for 5 years. I hope that they've changed their views about what a teacher looks like.
Yes, I would hope so too. Given the work that you put in that community, I would hope so
Mhm.
too. But I want to ask you about just life as a third culture kid in international schools because it's very unique. If
Mhm.
you've never experienced it, you cannot speak on what that is. You can't speak on the amount of internalized oppression and the amount of trauma that you experience going through this journey. So I'd love for you to just share what are some specific supports or resources that third culture students would need in order to be more comfortable and be more welcomed in their international school environment based on your own experience.
I think the biggest thing is teaching third culture kids about being a third culture kid. It's like, you know, in in psychology, like there's the phrase like name it to tame it. It's like that.
Right.
I didn't know that third culture kid as a phrase, as a label, as a concept existed until the end of my high school, like senior year. And once I found out what that was, then I could look up what it was on the internet. I had the right terms to start looking into, are there other people like me? And it led to like online communities and just certain books that I read to understand a little bit more about being a TCK. And I think that that was really big. I'm in a few online TCK groups now, and something we talk about a lot. It's they're all adults now, but something we talk a lot about is like it would have been helpful if we knew what we were growing up and knew that there was a group of people out there in the world that had similar experiences. And so that we weren't just feeling alone and feeling like we're weird or strange or not normal for having had the experiences that we did, which leads me to the next thing I think is important is the community. And what I found about TCKs is that once you mention that you're a TCK, there's um like this inherent understanding and like trust that you could share your life story and like no one will judge what you say or your experiences, and people are more likely to be like, oh yeah, I went through that too. I went to a TCK conference that was hosted in Chiang Mai back in October. And I met so many strangers that instantly became friends because there were so many things that we had in common. And I just felt really comfortable around them because I knew where they were coming from and they knew where I was coming from. So I think the best thing that schools can do is making sure the kids know what they are, and then like creating a community for them to talk to each other about their experiences.
Community is always key. And this actually leads me to my next question, and I think you started to answer it with the previous question I posed. But given the amount of moving you did as a child, starting at Japan, going to Taipei, going back to Japan, going to Boston, now you're in Thailand. How are you able to create that space of belonging for yourself where you no longer have to continue to question who you
Mhm.
are or even be worried about the perceptions people have of you?
I think pretty early on when I returned to Japan, I just had to accept that, like, I wasn't going to have a lot of friends, and that if I had just a couple of people who are okay with me being not Japanese enough, then that was all I needed. I think college was a little bit easier because a lot of people I met in college took an interest in me. I think for some people, I was maybe like the first Asian friend they've had. And so there was interest. And then I think once I got to know them as people, it just became easier to kind of overlook the ways in which I'm different from them. But I think it was moving to Vietnam for my first international job where I was like, "Oh, there's people at the school that look like me, that sound like me, that think like me." And that was the students. I think and even now at my school in Chiang Mai, when I think about, like, who looks like me and who sounds like me and who thinks like me, it's the students because they're living their, like, little TCK journey right now. And I think acknowledging that and recognizing that made me feel like, okay, like, maybe international schools is where my community is, where being a TCK is not unique because the majority of the students at international schools are TCKs. So I think, like, that's kind of been my community, and that's who I feel like I belong with.
Now, which makes total sense. I'm just thinking about the nature of international schools and how we put so much of a premium on white American or white European educators.
Mhm.
But then when you think about what an international school is, and when you think about the student body composition of an international school, don't you think that students or teachers who have third culture backgrounds are the best type of international educators to be in that space because of the fact that they've been well
Mhm.
traveled, because of the fact that they've been exposed to multiple languages and multiple cultures and ways of living? I just think it just makes sense. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I do too. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I agree.
Well, yeah, you're gonna say
And
that.
and I think, like, even if I don't know the particular cultures that my students are coming from, I I can still help them navigate between cultures because that's something that I had to do growing up. I I might not understand the specifics of why they feel like they're in between cultures, but I can understand that feeling, and I can hopefully provide some suggestions as to what to do with that. And that's just a skill that I've learned because of my upbringing. And I feel like teachers who grew up monoculturally maybe aren't as equipped to support students with their unique third culture experiences. So yeah, I do think who've gone through it would be phenomenal teachers, and I really wish more TCKs went into teaching. So I don't think there's enough of us right now.
Which I find fascinating because this will be the perfect job for a TCK.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm just thinking about the fact that as a TCK, you not only have the linguistic capital, but you have probably the greatest asset that comes with being an international educator, and that's navigational capital. The fact that you have to go from country to country every few years, learn new culture, learn new language, learn new systems, be surrounded by other educators from different walks of the world who are coming with their own funds of knowledge. So there's that professional navigational capital, but then there's the navigational capital that happens when you're within that school ecosystem in terms of dealing with identity politics and dealing with the perceptions and even the microaggressions that you experience being a TCK. So I just feel like there's a lot of perks there, and I wonder if it's something that needs to be brought to the attention of international school recruitment agencies and other entities that play a major role in employing international educators in these different spaces.
I also think I have social capital as well. When students find out that I'm a TCK, I think it's different for them to hear when I say like, "Oh no, I get what you're saying. I've been through it. Here's maybe how you can also get through it too." I think it's different from non-TCK teachers saying, I hear you and I think this is what you should do. And I think that just by me saying that like the way you're like, growing up is similar to how I grew up, I don't want to say it's automatic trust, but I think it quickly adds a layer of trust between my students and I.
Which is what you want for your students. You want them to be able to trust you with anything. You want them to be able to come to you and share, their deepest fears and some of the experiences that they're having being a TCK, because it's scary, and sometimes you might not be able to share that with your parents because they may not understand. I mean, you mentioned the fact that you were exploring your sexuality. So at that time, you couldn't come out to your parents because of just the cultural differences and just the views when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues. Like there are certain TCKs that are going through those similar issues internally, and they don't have an outlet to go to really unpack what they're feeling. So yeah, definitely having that community, as you mentioned, is extremely imperative.
Yeah, for sure.
So now you're still going through this journey. I'm wondering, how are you currently feeling? Do you feel at peace with who you are, and what are some things that you're still exploring about yourself in this identity journey that you're still on?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty comfortable in who I am. And I have to say, like, ALOC played a huge role in that. I have ALOC to thank for my confidence in who I am. Recently or in the last couple of years, I've also leaned into my neurodiversity and how ADHD manifests as challenges in my life. And that's made a difference in understanding who I am and my self-confidence and like feeling more secure in who I am. I'm actually still I have not come out to my family in Japan still to this day. And I go back and forth on sharing that part of me. But I've chosen to not do that for the time being. And I think my sexuality is going to be something that I'll keep exploring, not because I'm not certain about my sexuality, but because the society keeps introducing new and more inclusive labels. And so when I was younger, like I always identified as bisexual. And then I learned what like pansexual was. And I was like, oh, that applies too. And so I think maybe this isn't so much an exploration myself, but it's just finding different words that describe who I am. But then sometimes I get like tired of it too, and that's why I also use the word queer because I feel like that's all encompassing. But yeah, overall I am pretty comfortable with who I am. It's taken a really long time to be like, I like who I am now. But yeah, yeah, I think I like who I am.
As you should. I know for me, therapy played a huge role in getting me to better understand who I am, not
Oh yeah.
just as a human, but as a father, as a husband, understanding what it means to be a first generation Ghanaian American and understanding what that means for me, first and
Mhm,
foremost, and not what other people think about that. It's a process. It's definitely a process.
mhm,
So I'm so happy that you've found solace in who you are because there are a lot of people who are still trying to find that inner and outer peace so they could
mhm.
move forward in life. So as we close, I always ask this final question. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
Okay, that one's that's always a hard question. I think what I keep coming back to is this phrase, be the person you needed when you were younger.
Mm,
I did a presentation for ALOC in November on this, and I want to kind of explore it a little bit more. But like the question that I really ask myself is, who did I need when I was younger? What did I need? And then how do I provide those to the kids who might not be getting it right now? Um,
right.
and I found that asking myself those questions when I get stuck or when I like feel myself kind of going with the flow or compromising, I'm like, no, um, it's a disservice to the students, but it's also a disservice to me to not keep advocating and keep doing better, being better, right? Yeah, so that's kind of what I come back to.
Which is very important, very important. We could just keep on going, but I
I
know
know.
time as always is limited, but we will definitely have to do a part two. I say this to all my guests because the stories that come on this platform are so phenomenal, and I could
Mhm,
talk to y'all all day, honestly. But
for
Kanako,
sure.
thank you for taking time on your break to share a little bit about your story with us. For those who would like to learn more about you and connect, how can they do that? Either via social media or I know you have a website as well. If you want to share that.
Yeah, my Instagram is my full name, Kanako Suwa. My website, kanakosuwa.com. I'm not very original. Um, and yeah, you can also find me on LinkedIn under my full name, Kanako Suwa.
All right, y'all. Y'all heard it here. Make sure y'all connect with Kanako on those platforms. You can learn more about her and the work she's doing. Thank you again. And I hope you enjoy your break and take it easy.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
All right, people. So we're about to end another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.